Inside of Windows, I'm going to go to the Start menu, and I'm going to do a search just by typing for command, because what I want to open up is the command prompt. We're going to write our first program using some low-level tools and without Visual Studio, just so you can see a little bit about what is happening behind the scenes. When you install Visual Studio will install some command line tools that you can use to create applications. Not many people will use the command line tools on a day-to-day basis. They'll use Visual Studio instead. But what I'm just trying to do right now is simplify some things. So I'm going to go into my Documents folder, and I'm just going to use Notepad to create a file called hello.cs. The goal is to create the canonical hello world example, something I can run and just print the string hello world to the screen. And I'll do that by placing my code inside of a file called hello.cs. .cs is the common extension for C# source code. All of the .NET tools and every .NET developer will know that a .cs file will contain C# source code. And inside of here, I'm going to create a class. So there are many concepts that we're going to have to come to grips with in this very simple demo, things like classes and strange keywords. And we will cover all these things in detail throughout this course. For right now, just know that most of the code that you write for .NET will live inside of a class. And inside of a class, I can create methods. I'm going to create a method called main. The start of this method begins with this opening curly brace and ends with this closing curly brace, just like with the class. Anything I put between those outer curly braces will be part of this class or inside of this class. And now anything I put inside of this main method will be code that executes when I run this program. And that's because there's a little bit of magic happening here. When the CLR starts a command line application, what we call a console application, something that I would run from the command prompt, it will automatically look for a program class with a main method and just start executing the code inside of there for me. So if I were to place inside of here something like system.console.writeLine hello world, then this is something very similar to the code that we had on the slide. We had console.writeLine. What's new here is the system word, and the system word exists because inside of .NET there are thousands and thousands of classes that I can use, classes like console. And we don't want all 10,000 or more classes available at one time, so what .NET does is it partitions classes into various namespaces. And to use a class, you have to be very explicit and let .NET know from what namespace that class lives in. So to use the console class, it lives in a namespace called system. So I either have to use the word system here, or there's another way to tell .NET about the namespaces that I need, and that is with the using keyword. So if I say using system and a semicolon, and yes, there are certain pieces of code that have to end with a semicolon and certain pieces of code that don't need a semicolon. We'll talk about that more throughout the course. When I say using system, I'm telling .NET and this tool we're about to see, known as the C# compiler, that when it encounters classes inside of this program, classes like console, it should look for them inside of the system namespace. And this is about the simplest possible C# program that I could write. I'm going to save this file and come out to the command line and run a tool called csc.exe. This tool exists by default in my Windows directory under a folder called Microsoft.NET. Inside of there will be a framework folder. And then inside of a framework folder, you can have various installations of the .NET framework, multiple versions. And if I tab through here, you can see I have various versions installed. Version 1, version 1.1, version 2. I want to go to the latest version, which is the version 4 directory, because inside of there will be a little program that I can run called CSC. CSC, as you can see, is the Visual C# compiler. So C# code is code that needs to be compiled before it can execute. This is unlike some other languages like Perl and Ruby and Python. What I need to do with the C# code is pass it through the C# compiler, and what the C# compiler will do is produce an executable that I can run. So if I say CSC and then follow that with the parameter hello.cs, I'm asking the C# compiler to compile hello.cs. And if the compiler encounters any problems, it will complain, but it looks like it finished successfully, and inside of this folder now I can see hello.exe. So the act of compiling hello.cs produced hello.exe, and the exe extension means this is an executable file, something that I can run from the command line, and if I run it just by typing in hello.exe, I get hello world. Now, as I said before, typically you don't use CSC directly. Instead, you use Visual Studio, and Visual Studio will figure out the way to call CSC correctly. But I do just want to point out that CSC might give you some error messages. So for example, let's say that I forget the semicolon after using system and I recompile the application. The C# compiler here is very explicit and it says semicolon was expected on line 1, column 13. Unfortunately, not all error messages are so explicit. Let's come down and leave off an opening curly brace here on my method, because now the C# compiler won't know where this method starts. And if I save that file and try to compile it again, this one missing character actually generated 3 different error messages. It's telling me a semicolon was expected and there's an invalid token. And over time, you'll become accustomed to these error messages and become accustomed to looking at your C# code and figuring out things like, oh, I just had a missing curly brace here. And if I save this file again, we should be back in working order. But let's make one more change. Instead of displaying the text, hello world, let's use some more code from that previous slide. And I want to print out the current day of the week. And I can do that by using the datetime class. That datetime class is also in the system namespace, so it is available to me. I can have multiple using statements here, but the only classes I'm using for this simple example are classes that are in the system namespace. I'm going to say, please print out datetime.now.day of week. And I'll save hello.cs again. I need to recompile it for CSC to pick up those changes and produce a new executable. But now I should be able to run hello.exe. And you can see that this example is being recorded on a Wednesday. So this simple example has a lot of very deep concepts like classes and strange keywords like static and void. I want you to ignore some of those specific syntax details for right now. We'll get to the point where you can understand all of this. For right now, I just want to take a step back and talk about this compiler that we're using. And after that, we can jump into Visual Studio and get the same code running from Visual Studio.